Good evening, good evening. What a joy it is that we get to greet one another. We hear each other's voices and the happiness and being able to see old friends, make new friends, right? You could hear that excitement in the air as we're gathering. Thank you so much for being here and welcome. Welcome to Twin Towers United Methodist Church. I am Akesa Po'oi Fakava, and I have the great joy and privilege of being the pastor of this community of faith who desire to be conduits of healing and justice for all. And again, welcome to all of you here in the building, as well as our friends who are joining us on Zoom. So just a couple of housekeeping items for us before we get started. First, if you haven't already done so, if you could please take a look at your phones and ensure that it's silenced. I'd hate to have that important call that may come through or text interrupt our conversation. Number two, the restrooms, if you go to the back of your aisle and go to the left, down that little ramp and just go down the hall, the first right, you'll see a sign there for the ladies' room, and through the big room, you'll also see another sign for the gentleman's restroom as well. So again, just through that door, down the ramp, and you'll see a couple of signs there. So again, thank you for being here. So the reason that we are here tonight is because as a people of faith, we are committed to seeking peace with justice for ourselves, in community, and in solidarity with others. We recognize that in the work towards peace with justice, there are many perspectives and many paths. And this is especially true for the faith tradition. We do not all think the same, and we don't always agree. Imagine, right? We invited Rabbi David Cooper tonight because we are interested in hearing a perspective from within Judaism that calls for ceasefire. This is a perspective that we are less familiar with and one that we do not always hear often. I am very grateful that Rabbi Cooper said yes to joining us tonight. And so we enter tonight's event with a spirit of curiosity, of openness, and with a commitment towards seeking understanding. Following Rabbi Cooper's talk, all will have a chance or an opportunity to raise questions. This is the time to exercise that curiosity, that openness, and commitment. Our process for the Q&A conversation is that for those of you on Zoom, you can feel free to use chat, and we'll receive your questions that way through our hosts. And for those of you in the building, the ask is, as you entered, you were given a card and a pencil. If you have not, raise your hand and one can be brought to you. Both of those can be brought. We're asking that you please write your name and question on the card provided, and also asking that you please help our moderators by writing clearly and as legible as possible. The cards will be collected and shared with Rabbi David by our moderators. And if you brought a question with you, please write it down and indicate it. And Reverend Emily Lynn, and I think everybody pretty much knows, but if you don't, she is always moving around and taking care of things. If you wouldn't mind, Reverend Emily, and so she will pick up your cards if you have them now or when the Q&A begins. And I would also like to mention that Eve Gordon will be moderating our conversation also. Finally, we recognize that this is a tender moment, that our diverse community is very much grieving, living with loss, fear, and anxiety, as we desire a future with peace, justice, healing, and liberation. And they're not just possible, but present and in motion. So given this, let us pause to be in our breath, to slow down and get present, touch into gratitude for being together in community, and invite the spirit of grace and deep listening to be with us all. So I would ask that you join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. I would at this time like to invite the Reverend Dr. Judith Pruis Mello to come forward and introduce our special guests for this evening.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We want to also welcome the people on Zoom. We understand that, well, as of last night, we had about 20 people signed up, and I'm sure some more today. So there's quite an audience on Zoom, and welcome. And welcome to Rabbi David Cooper. He is Rabbi Emeritus of Kehilla Community Synagogue in the Oakland, Piedmont area. He co-founded the synagogue with Rabbi Bert Jacobson in 1984. It was dedicated to a progressive vision of social activism inspired by the writings of the Hebrew prophets. Rabbi David grew up surrounded by traditions in the conservative and Orthodox Jewish traditions. He grew up in a Zionist family and first visited Israel and Palestine just after the 1967 war. During the next 56 years, he has supported equal rights and dignity for all Israelis and Palestinians and has been active against the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So please welcome now Rabbi David Cooper.
Thank you. So I want to thank you, Reverend Judith and Pastor Akesa. I want to thank Twin Towers Methodist Church for having this gathering this evening and inviting me. Before I read you what I prepared, I'm not sure that that I prepared myself to give you the Jewish view on ceasefire. But I'll off script here, I'll say that it does say in our scriptural writings, Bakesh Shalom V'rodfehu, demand peace and pursue it. And so I think many of us who are in favor of ceasefire are motivated by that. But when I read, you'll see that I also think other people who don't agree with me may also be motivated by that same thing. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that that I didn't prepare is that there's an interesting piece in the Talmud, the tractate on Sabbath, Masechet Shabbat, and it says as follows. All who are able to protest the transgressions of their family and do not protest are captured in the transgressions of their family. And then it says, for your city, in the transgressions of your city. For the transgressions of the whole world, you're captured in transgressions of the whole world. So you must protest when you see something that needs to be protested. So I think it would be of some service to start by explaining in brief my relationship with Israel-Palestine over the course of my life, and I may be repeating some of the things that Judith just told us. So bear with me because I didn't edit this after she spoke. So she was saying, I come from a Zionist family and a progressive family. I was a member of Hashomer Tzair as a teenager, which is a left socialist Zionist youth movement. In my family, when my siblings and I reached the age of 16, we were expected to spend a summer in Israel. I turned 16 in June of 1967. I landed in Haifa a few weeks after the war. When I arrived, there was an elation in the air and also a belief that peace was at hand, as Israel was expected by many people to trade back the occupied territories for a permanent peace with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. We were advised to visit East Jerusalem and the West Bank because they might only be in Israeli control for a short time. With a tour group, I went to Jerusalem, especially to see the Wailing Wall, where Jews had not been able to go since the war in 1948. I knew what I would see there because in Hebrew school and in all the synagogues that I attended, there was always an old photo or a painting of the Western Wall. In the picture, there were people praying facing the wall, and behind them, a street and houses just opposite the wall. It was a narrow street in front of the wall. But it didn't look like that when I got there. Instead of a narrow street, the houses were gone, and instead it was an open plaza. I asked the tour guide if Jordan had taken down the houses facing the wall, and he answered no, that Israel had taken them down just a few weeks before. I then asked the question that a 16-year-old would ask, but what about the people who live here? With a disdainful expression, he replied, "What does that matter?" Well, it did matter to me, and it still does. Several things began to bother me that summer. But later in the year, I learned that Jewish settlements were being put into the occupied territory, and I felt that this would be an obstacle to any peaceful resolution. That was 56 years ago. And I've been against the occupation ever since. Since 2017, actually, I'm gonna have to, while you're snapping, I'm gonna need a little water. Now, since 2017, I've participated in the Center for Jewish Nonviolence on delegations to the West Bank, especially the South Hebron Hills, where we have worked together with Palestinians in dedicated nonviolent resistance to the occupation. Since October 7th, I've been in contact with what is happening with the villagers with whom I've come to love. I am very concerned for them as settlers have stepped up their oppressive raids with impunity while everyone's attention is fixed on the war in Gaza. Now, 40 years ago, as a layperson, I worked with Rabbi Bert Jacobson to start Kehilla Synagogue here in the East Bay. And as Judith was saying, devoted to spiritual and progressive synagogue and legacy of the Hebrew prophets. But one of the things was that our dedication as a synagogue was to human rights extended to Palestinians equally with Israeli Jews. And that was from 1984. That did not make us very popular. In 1999, I began an 18-year stretch serving the congregation as its rabbi. I'm now Rabbi Emeritus. I've spoken a few times why I support ceasefire, but I understand that this is not a gathering where I need to convince you of the need for a permanent and immediate halt to violence. So I want to talk with you about an aspect of the situation that I am experiencing. I've been a witness in the last 3 months as people have expressed their support and their opposition to a ceasefire. I've watched how we talk right past each other. As for me, I am daily, if not hourly, in connection to all sides of the issue as a member of the rabbinate and as someone active for ceasefire. I've been with lay people and rabbis as they've poured their hearts out to me these last 3 months. I want to talk about how, for those of us who oppose Israel's war on Gaza, that it is necessary for us to hold compassion for Jewish trauma. This is not only a moral necessity, I argue that it is strategically important for advancing our part toward Palestinian freedom. If I were talking to a crowd that was against ceasefire, I would talk about the trauma that the Palestinian people have suffered and how all this starts way before October 7th, and about how the Nakba and the ongoing displacement and massive killing has created and is creating intergenerational trauma. I think we do not have to underline this for you tonight. I want to start with a history lesson because I've been reminded lately of how little so many of us know of the history that has framed Jewish trauma, which is shaping so much of what is happening now. The current situation, again, did not start on October 7th, and it did not start with the previous Gaza wars, nor in the 1967 war that resulted in the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. It did not begin in 1948, and it did not begin with the Holocaust, and it did not begin with the political Zionist movement. But it also did not begin in ancient times either, as if to say that Jews and Arabs have been enemies for thousands of years. We have not. Jews and Palestinians are victims of historical forces far beyond Palestine. Where I would start with is the prevalence of anti-Jewish oppression in Christian Europe that reigned for hundreds of years. While Jews in Arab countries were treated as what we call today second-class citizens, in most places in the Arab world, the Jews were not oppressed as they were in Europe. The Jews of Europe were treated as expendable pariahs, confined to ghettos, not allowed to own land or to engage in farming, frequently dispossessed and expelled, used as scapegoats by the authorities to blame Jews for economic woes and plagues or for anything that went wrong. Jews were not allowed to be citizens of the society at large in Europe. They were not regarded as Prussians, French, or Polish. They were Jews. They were members of the ghetto, not of Prussia, France, or Poland, no matter how many generations they lived there, no matter how much they wanted to belong. The next important development that frames today's reality is what is referred to as the emancipation of the Jews in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. In the early 1800s, Jews as individuals were now allowed to be citizens directly of their country. This is in Western Europe, and in this somewhat far off distant place across the Atlantic called the United States, a recently formed country. Actually, the first country where Jews were able to be citizens of their own country and not citizens of the ghetto. Much of the anti-Jewish laws in Western Europe were taken down. Theoretically, it meant Jews were now free to participate in the full range of opportunities that other citizens enjoyed. Jews flocked out of the ghettos to join the society at large, but they hit a wall. The legislation had changed, but anti-Jewish sentiment was still prevalent, and a backlash to the emancipation grew in force throughout the 1800s, including a political ideology that gave itself the title of anti-Semitism, by which they meant being against anyone with Jewish lineage, regardless of their religious belief. The anti-Semites felt that the emancipation had gotten out of hand. This was a backlash against freedom for Jews, and I think all of us here today understand anti-democratic backlash, since we are right in the middle of it here in the US today, directed against the rights of people of color, women, LGBTQ folk, and others. In the late 1800s, Jews were divided over 5 different strategies to deal with anti-Semitism. The first was to emigrate away from it. But even in the US, in the early 20th century, Jews encountered legally sanctioned anti-Semitism. The second was to convert to Christianity. But this failed as a strategy because anti-Semitism was not based on your religion, but on your genetic heritage. The third was what I call the bourgeois approach, a strategy to show that Jews could be good Germans, good Frenchmen, and they were serving as true patriots of their countries. Germany was the most liberal country to its emancipated Jews, and we know what happened there eventually. The fourth was what I call the working class approach, which was to join with the international forces for socialist revolution, and that in the wake of the revolution, anti-Semitism would simply die. This approach also did not hold up, especially as evidenced by the history of the Soviet Union. The fifth approach, which was favored by only a minority of Jews at the time, was to establish a country for Jews. Self-emancipation, it was called. So essentially, if the emancipation had been allowed to succeed, there would never have arisen a Zionist movement. The failure of the emancipation and the subsequent Holocaust has upped the intergenerational trauma to a tremendous degree. Before the emancipation, Jews knew that they could be subjected to pogroms or expulsion by intolerant rulers. But after the failure of the emancipation, another traumatic element was added, that even if you are in a country where you are a free citizen, you cannot feel confident that your welcome will last. That trauma is now underlying how parts of the Jewish community are responding to the rising opposition to Israel's actions in Gaza. There is a triggering of a loss of confidence of being safe in America. Even those of us Jews who call for a ceasefire and who have been in active opposition to the occupation and have long supported Palestinian rights have been a bit shaken when some parts of the pro-Palestinian movement approve of the massacre of October 7th or deny its criminal character. We Jews who support Palestinian freedom do take comfort that this is not a majority position of those who support a ceasefire, but it does give public relations ammunition to Netanyahu against our opposition to Israel's war in Gaza. I say this not to stop us from supporting a ceasefire or from opposing the massive killing in Gaza, but we do need to know the history that is tearing people apart inside. And we need to understand that if we want to act strategically to support freedom for the Palestinian people, we must understand this. If you ask me what your role is as Christians, I believe it is your job now to be an ally to both the Palestinian people and to the Jewish people. To be an ally to the Jewish people, however, does not mean that you must support the killing in Gaza. It does mean that in every situation that arises, we need to approach it compassionately and strategically, which is difficult, if not impossible, to get it right every time. But we need to try. I'll give you an example. It may get a little controversial here. I was happy that the city of Richmond was going to consider a resolution supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. When I read the first draft, which was widely circulated, then I read the first draft. And among other issues, it totally failed to mention anything about the horrors of October 7th. And last minute, an acknowledgement of the massacre was added to the draft. But if one were acting strategically, it should have been there from the very start. The later emendation was experienced by many of us as an added afterthought. What many Jews experienced was that this omission was evidence that the massive killing of civilians in the Hamas attack was treated as if it had no significance. I've watched as the Richmond resolution has been used as a cudgel against other ceasefire resolutions that followed. And those subsequent revolutions were far, far better and have taken seriously the need to address the very real horror of October 7th and also the rise of anti-Semitism. Without this being done with honesty and compassion, we cannot expect to be heard as we condemn the slaughter that is being perpetrated against the people of Gaza every day now. There is another aspect of leading with compassion that can be very difficult, and that is not to treat those people who are supporting Israel's actions as if they were the enemy. I am opposed to what they advocate, but I also know their fears. I find that most of the people I speak to who are opposed to ceasefire do not hate the Palestinian people. From my point of view, they may be mistaken about ceasefire, but they sincerely believe that a ceasefire now would end up making Hamas stronger than before October 7th and more likely to launch even worse violence against Israeli citizens and end up causing even more Palestinian deaths. They regret that so many civilians are being killed, but they see this as a result of the jeopardy that Hamas has put upon the civilians of Gaza. I may disagree, but they are sincere and they are not being disingenuous when they say this. Yelling at people who feel this way or treating them as the enemy is more likely to drive them away than to draw them into an understanding of the injustice of the Israeli assault and of the necessity to stop it immediately. You may think that there is no persuading people who feel this way. That is not true. Every week I see more and more people coming over and supporting a ceasefire who didn't previously. 2 weeks ago, Israeli expats living in the Bay Area held a rally for a ceasefire in San Francisco. These are people who never before in their lives opposed Israeli military action before. Now, I want to take a moment to switch gears a bit. I want to consider systemic anti-Semitism and how it affects our efforts. Over the last number of years, the progressive perspective on racism has become more sophisticated. Racism is now better understood not just as a conscious personal hatred of people of color, and racism is not only the persistent embedded economic and societal structures that perpetuate inequality and inequity. It is also the unconscious ideological water within which we swim. All of us swim in that water. And we should be suspicious of anyone who claims that they are not racist, because anyone who claims this has given up examining their unconscious assumptions. As progressive activists, we need to always bring to the fore that because without that examination, we are likely to make strategic mistakes in our organizing or engage in unintended microaggressions. However, I do not see where we on the left have been as deep or as nuanced in our analysis of anti-Semitism as we have been about racism. Stay there in abeyance and wonder what I'm going to say next. Anti-Semitism is also ideologically systemic, and it too is water that we swim in, including Jews as well. If we do not subject what we do consciously to examine what we do consciously, to examine what we are doing in light of systemic anti-Semitism, we will make moral and strategic errors. I cannot give you a course on anti-Semitism tonight, but I want us to consider that while the failure to make any mention of the October 7th massacre in the original draft of the Richmond Resolution was not the result of any conscious hatred of Jews, it was nevertheless a moral and strategic error that may have been avoided by examining our unconscious anti-Semitism. If we hold an unconscious assumption that Jews are powerful manipulators, then we are more apt to disregard Jewish vulnerability and without thinking, make no reference to the massacre. Thus, you end up playing into the hands of those who support the bombardment of Gaza. So if you want to learn more about anti-Semitism as systemic, I do not recommend accepting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IRA definition, with its illustrations of what they see as examples of anti-Semitism. These examples suffer from another form of systemic prejudice, anti-Palestinianism. But that's a topic of another discussion. So if you're serious about understanding the systemic anti-Semitism in which we are swimming, I recommend the online pamphlet put out by the New York City-based organization Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or JFREJ. And their pamphlet is called Understanding Anti-Semitism and Offering to Our Movement. So all you need to do is to Google JFREJ, JFREJ, and then anti-Semitism, and it should pop right up. It's a really good read. This is an online pamphlet, and I want to quote just one sentence from it. Anti-Semitism is real. It is antithetical to collective liberation and hurts Jews, but not only Jews. It undermines, weakens, and derails all of our movements for social justice and collective liberation. So here are a few notes I wrote about talking to Jews as Christians, about talking to Jews, you as Christians who support a ceasefire. You may be talking to Jews who oppose a ceasefire. You may be talking to Jews who support a ceasefire. And you may be talking to Jews whom you do not know their position. So here's my advice for what it's worth. If you're talking to Jews who oppose ceasefire, consider these talking points. Although we disagree with you about this, we do not demonize you nor disrespect you. We know that you sincerely believe that this is necessary to protect Israelis from terrorism. We disagree because we understand that the level of civilian deaths is far too high to justify the aim of eliminating Hamas. Moreover, we do not believe that this will leave Israelis any more secure. Now, if you're talking to Jews you do not know where they stand, this is important. Do not make any assumptions about where people's positions and about their positions, and do not jump to engage in conversation about Israel-Palestine to determine where they stand. Doing this is likely to be felt as a microaggression and a litmus test to determine whether they are a good Jew or a bad Jew by your definition. If you're talking to Jews who support ceasefire, like I do not treat us as a confirmation that you are right about ceasefire. Don't use my Jewishness to bolster your argument for ceasefire. That there are Jews like me who support a ceasefire proves nothing. Moreover, every one of us have to examine ourselves for unconscious anti-Jewish bias. So do not use my support for ceasefire to exempt yourself from that self-examination. Do not use me to prove that you're not anti-Semitic. So I want to share with you some excerpts of what I wrote in November to illustrate some of what I said this evening, maybe as an example of how I try to play with this. This is from an essay I called Beyond Understanding, which is a double entendre that you'll find out about. One thing this is what I wrote. One thing that scares me is how callous so many of us have become. What really scares me is how understandable this callousness is. People have been traumatized or re-traumatized by learning of and seeing the massacres of Jews and others on October 7th. So it is understandable why many cannot grieve for the subsequent killing of Palestinians by Israeli retaliation. And other people have been outraged by the mass killing of so many innocent Palestinian people that for them, focusing on October 7th is just a distraction from the slaughter in Gaza. And this too is understandable. I believe that the spiritual mandate at this moment is to go beyond the understandable. I also believe that it is a strategic mandate for those of us who support Palestinian freedom. Yesterday, this is again written several weeks ago, but it could have been yesterday, I received yet another piece of email from some Jewish institution that focused entirely on the atrocity of October 7th and the tragedy of the hostages. It referred to the bombing of Gaza as a war on terrorism, without any mention of the thousands of civilians killed. I also received a pro-Palestinian email that referred to October 7th only as the day Israel began its war on Gaza. How do we decide how many civilian deaths are acceptable for eliminating a Hamas commander? 10, 50, 100? The formula is not to consider how many Palestinian civilians could be sacrificed, but how many Jewish Israeli deaths would be acceptable to obtain the same purpose. If the acceptable number of dead Palestinians exceeds the acceptable number of dead Israelis, then it is a war crime. It is disproportionate. Under international law, civilians are civilians regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of whom they voted for, regardless of whom they hope will win the conflict. As of this writing on November 8th, more than 10,000 people in Gaza have been killed, over 4,000 children. Would this be acceptable collateral damage if they were Jewish? At this moment, it is Palestinians in Gaza who are suffering the most from relentless bombing. Mega death will be ineffective at making Israelis any safer and can only create more fatalities, more permanent injuries, more suffering, more trauma, and more displacement for the people of Gaza. And that is why I must support a ceasefire. In the West Bank, settlers are terrorizing Palestinian villages, including the village with which Kehilla is connected through our personal friendships and our face-to-face group. Panim el Panim, it's called. I often wake up to a text message from a villager there. He texts me how the settlers and the army have entered the village and at gunpoint order the people around or force them to sit in the cold and go through their possessions and phones. Some of the young men were beaten while offering no resistance. I should add that is a village that is dedicated to nonviolent resistance, as inspired by the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh. At the same time, I know of the tragedy of a person I know whose niece was abducted and was then a hostage in Gaza. But does it have to be personal before we feel the pain on both sides? The time has come to throw out the numbers, the statistics. Each number is a human being. 4,000 children dead in Gaza is my granddaughter multiplied by 4,000. Each person killed in the early light of a music festival is my daughter multiplied by 1,200. Enough already. My suffering does not negate yours. Your suffering does not negate mine. Yes, the number of the dead in Gaza far exceeds the deaths of the massacre on October 7th, but that does not negate nor diminish the trauma of that day for Israelis and Jews. But the numbers cannot calculate the value of what has been lost. They cannot enumerate the long grief-filled decades ahead. The Quran and the Talmud draw the same conclusion when interpreting the story of Adam, Cain, and Abel. So here's a quote from the Talmud. Therefore, Adam was created alone to teach you that anyone who destroys one soul, the verse ascribes to them as if they destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves one soul, the verse ascribes to them as if they saved an entire world. And now from the Quran. Therefore, we ordained for the children of Israel that one who slays a soul shall be as if they had slain all humankind, and one who saves a life shall be as if they had given life to all humankind. By what factor can you multiply slain humankind to determine the extent of the damage and pain? During these weeks, we are seeing a surge in anti-Semitism and its mirror image anti-Palestinian bias. There are clear incidents where anti-Israel or anti-Zionist action has devolved into outright anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic microaggressions. And there are clear incidents where anti-Hamas rhetoric has devolved into words of hatred and worse against Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. For years, Judaism and Zionism have been conflated. This works in two directions. The Israeli establishment has always conflated Judaism with Zionism. To be a good Jew, one is assumed to be a Zionist. This has never been true. And anti-Semites make the same conflation. To kill a Jew is to kill a Zionist. That some Jews make that conflation does not give anyone a license to engage in anti-Semitism. And likewise, Hamas and Palestinians, Hamas and Muslims, Hamas and Arabs, they've all been conflated. Conflation under the circumstance is completely understandable, but our mandate is to go beyond the understandable to what is morally, practically, and strategically necessary. Support for Palestinian freedom does not preclude outrage for the massacre of Israelis. Outrage at the massacres does not preclude empathy for the ongoing hourly assault and suffering of the Palestinian people. Chesed, or loving kindness, is not a sum zero quality. There's more than enough to go around. We also need to have chesed for each other. We need to remember that we are all enveloped in multi-generational trauma. Past pogroms, the Holocaust, the Nakba are all still part of our active consciousness. Each of us needs to be able to listen and hear others with compassion, even for those who have emphases different from our own. If we cannot do this, then there is little hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi David. That was very moving. There are tissues around if anybody needs them. Again, I am Eve Gordon, and I am a Jewish member of the Alameda Families and Friends for Ceasefire group, and really, really honored to be here with you all, and super honored to be here with you, local hero. So we're going to be taking some questions. If you have questions, and you can write them on the little note cards, and Pastor Emily is going to come around if you want to just pass them to the center aisle. And so we got two so far. So we'll start there. So the first one is a little bit of a doozy, but once this war ends, however it ends, what do you imagine advocating should happen next? Right. So beyond an immediate ceasefire, what might we support?
I wish I could answer that question easily. I think the way that I've put it before is saying eventually there needs to be a space where between the river and the sea, where every Jew and every Palestinian and everybody who is, neither of those who lives there has equal rights and equal national rights, not just equal human rights. And I have no idea what the sovereignty arrangement would need to be. One state or two states or confederation, just as long as people can live securely and have self-determination. So what happens after this fighting is over? I really don't know. And I don't think it, I mean, I've been asked at times, challenged, somebody was saying to me, okay, so you're against ceasefire, you're for ceasefire. You know, what happens after that? So I say, well, you're against ceasefire. What happens after that? So just because I can't answer the question about what happens after that doesn't mean I don't support a ceasefire, because without a ceasefire, I don't think anything is really possible. And by the way, I actually want to say this. I do think those resolutions are necessary. I think that going to demonstrations is necessary. Okay, and the reason is that if there is no pressure at all put, none of us come out, then Netanyahu and his cohort will feel that they have a carte blanche to proceed, and they will proceed and proceed and proceed, as you know, for far beyond the deaths that have come up until now. And what's more, I'm deeply concerned because mass starvation is about to break out in Gaza as well. And that will actually take the numbers of people who have died so far by violence, and it will eclipse that. There will be far many times that people are going to die, more over times than the people who have died so far just from sickness and from starvation. So to me, it's like we need to be able to hit the streets and be able to, and especially for the United States government, for the Biden administration to understand that they now have to really put the stops on Israel. So get
Thank
out in the
you.
streets and, sign the petitions and advance resolutions, but do keep in mind some of the considerations that I mentioned tonight.
Can you speak to the understanding of the chosen people and how this relates to how different Jewish communities understand themselves?
Okay, well, first of all, there's in the Bible, it's sort of more spoken of as the treasured people. Chosen, I think, is an interesting translation that came up much later. And it was a concept that was really more emphasized during the times of Jewish oppression. It doesn't seem to have come up as much in other periods. And so I think if you are being told by Christian Europe that you are only allowed, that Christianity has allowed you to survive to witness how you've been subjugated by Christianity, how Christianity is victorious, and we need you as witnesses to see that we've been victorious, then you've been told over and over again that you lost and that you're essentially not really worth very much. So to say to yourself, despite all of this, is a way in which God has chosen us for some purpose, is a survival technique. The question is, what benefit does that have in the 20th century? So, for example, back in the 1940s, the Reconstructionist Jewish movement eliminated all references to chosenness in its prayer book. So, for example, it says, Asher Bachar Banim, when we're doing a blessing over wine, there's one point that says, who's chosen us has chosen us from all peoples and has blessed us with Torah or whatever it may be. So the Hebrew is Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim. In Kehilla, my synagogue, we say Asher Bachar Banu Im Kol Ha'amim. All we've done is reverse two sounds, but it means who has chosen us not from all people, but has chosen us with all people. And so there is a growing disfavor, especially in the progressive Jewish community, to continue using the chosenness. But I also think about that moment in Fiddler on the Roof, where where Tevye, looks up at God and he says, "So we're the chosen people. Can you choose somebody else, please?" So anyway, I just get a laugh out of that. I get a theological laugh out of that.
Thank you. Okay, this is a good one. As a person who has directly and repeatedly experienced white supremacist violence,
Mm.
I struggle with the notion of extending compassion and extending myself to people who vocally and actively oppose my humanity.
Mhm.
How do we stay safe and sane while also being morally, spiritually, and strategically responsive?
It's really hard. It's really hard. I've um, uh, and I can blame nobody for failing in this task from time to time or always. So strategically, my thought is just, I can hate what they say and hate what they feel, but if I basically come out and do it and say, certainly if this comes to blows, I'm going to defend myself and hit back. Not that I really know what to do about that, but that's another story. But if it's a question of speaking, then I would not do it by yelling and screaming, because that just would push them into the same space. So in this case, you just have to take it within the situation, and I can blame nobody for not having compassion for people who hate you. My question is it strategic not to have the compassion? Martin Luther King was an absolute radical and put himself on the line on a lot of stuff, and yet he was thought it strategic not to essentially face racism with a kind of with a lack of compassion, and I also think about how this is right. Now it's just after the anniversary of his birth and the anniversary of the death of his close friend Abraham Joshua Heschel, and they both spoke against the war in Vietnam, but they didn't speak about it like saying, Johnson, you're a bad man, kind of thing. It was more like, this is a failure of our best selves. And so I think there's something compassionate in the way that and the war in Vietnam had to end immediately from the get-go. And there were deaths happening every day. And Dr. King's speech at Riverside Church, emphasizes the horror of what was happening. So again, I can't blame anybody for not being able to respond to hatred with compassion. Can't do it. My only question, and on top of which, I probably would fail at that myself. Doesn't mean that it's strategic. And I've been trying to play strategically since October 7th with people who I really violently disagree with, or excuse me, I disagree with nonviolently.
I've been wondering in this about the role of coalition and community
Mm.
and responding across a collective so that we can take different roles in different moments.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the previous question for a second. I also cannot blame anybody. I can't blame anybody, a Palestinian, for not having compassion. If you know, if so many people in their family have died, you know, or been killed, and you know, I know of. I met Dr. Iseldine, whose nieces were killed back in the previous Gaza war, and more than 30 of his family were killed during this war. And you know, he still manages to fight this kind of oppression with compassion. He's not. It does not that he lacks anger. I'm sure he's very angry. The question is, how does he proceed? So, could you frame what you just said as a question? Because I
Yeah,
didn't see
you
the
know what?
question.
Actually, I'm looking at the time and I know we don't have that much time. How much time do we have left? Like 5 minutes? Okay. So
Well, we
I
have a bunch
actually,
of questions.
yeah, I have some, I'm going to move us on. Okay. So this question says, can you talk a little bit more about the challenges and importance of shifting the narrative of, you know, supporting Israel 100% within the Jewish community? Why is criticizing Israel so difficult within the Jewish community in particular?
Well, for one thing, people are, I mean, mind, this is not true of all Jews, but the Jews for whom there is a serious problem, especially, say, folks in some of the mainstream Jewish institutions, there is a real sense that what happened on October 7th is proof of things to come that are going to be essentially result in the death of our own people. And so that if you're coming out for ceasefire, then it seems as if you're coming out in support of Hamas, because you haven't finished completing the task of defeating Hamas. And so we're perceived from that sector as if we were traitors or supporters of the enemy. And that's beginning to fade in many sectors. And one of the things is that the more and more this happens, I think there are two possible divisions that go on. One is you become more and more entrenched in your position because of cognitive dissonance, or what I call it, ethical dissonance. If this is going on, it must be worthwhile, and so I'm going to stick with it. And then the other reaction goes in the opposite direction. This is too much already. And I'm coming across quite a number of people who are saying to me, I was against ceasefire before, and now I'm against it. And several of them have said, and I should have figured that out earlier. Yeah, it's difficult. And by the way, speaking to Israelis who are still in Israel, it's really difficult because anybody in this room knows more about what's happening in Gaza than somebody who's in Israel right now who's watching television 24/7, because they're not seeing any of the pictures in Gaza and they don't know what's happening. And so when you tell them that you're in favor of a ceasefire, to them it's like, and then there are people in the United States who have cousins in Israel, and they say, who am I to tell the Israelis what to do? They're telling me that this is the right thing. And I said, well, on the basis of that approach. Who am I to tell the Palestinians what to do? I don't live there. You know, so
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more, and there's, oh gosh, okay.
find the best one.
Oh, it's so hard. There's a lot of good ones here.
Don't feel insulted if she doesn't choose.
I know, please don't, if you get your feelings hurt, you want to talk about it with me afterwards, I'll be available for 5 minutes. Garrett will be available for longer. Okay. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned us about white moderates.
Mm.
The intersections of white supremacy and Zionism are evident today.
Mhm.
How do we navigate this?
Well, I mean, to me, I think a large part of what's governing Israel today is Jewish supremacy. And it takes very similar forms as white supremacy, including things like trying to negate the history of another people. The way I put it is there's no land acknowledgement in Israel. A friend of mine, I was in Israel with a group of rabbis who were all against the occupation, and we were in this town, Lifta, which is just outside of Jerusalem. And it's a town that was abandoned because nearby was Deir Yassin, the site of the Great Massacre in 1948. And the people of Lifta fled with the hope that they would be coming back soon. They never were allowed to come back. And so we're touring through Lifta, and a friend of mine, another rabbi, she looks up and she sees this hill in the distance with some buildings on it. And she turns to the tour guide and she goes, "Isn't that Givat Shaul? Because, you know, I studied there for 4 months." And he looked at her and he said, "Yes, that's Givat Shaul, Deir Yassin." And she just went white. She had no idea that she had been studying at the site of the Deir Yassin massacre, and nobody told her. She said up until then, she'd always been thinking about 1967. All of a sudden, she began to think about 1948. So when you try to erase another people's history, I call that historical genocide. And we're engaged in that process in the United States with trying to knock out any true education about the history of our racism here. And Israel, the establishment in Israel is intent on doing the same thing. What we have to do is maintain our opposition to white supremacy, and as Jews, I maintain my opposition to Jewish supremacy. There are so many opportunities to engage in that opposition. Don't miss your chance. It's something we're going to have to do, not just now, but given the circumstances that we're in, it's something that we're going to have to engage in for the rest of our lives and hope that our children can carry it on after us.
It's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much, Rabbi David Cooper. It's an honor to have you here, and thank you to everybody who was tuning in on Zoom. Appreciate having you all with us, and thank you to everybody here. If you are interested in learning more, I want to reiterate the resource that you spoke about earlier, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Did I get it right?
Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, JFREJ.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
just do JFREJ, anti-Semitism, and it'll come up.
Okay, awesome. Also, I want to
Get out your phones and do it now.
yes, you could get out your phones and do it right now. Also, I want to put out a plug. If you are interested in understanding more of the schism that's happening right now within American Jewish communities and American Judaism, There is a film called Israelism. And you can search that up. It's, I don't know what it would be like for somebody who's not Jewish, but as a Jewish person, super deep. And lots of fodder for discussion. So
Yeah, it follows at least a friend of mine, Simone Zimmerman, who was essentially primed to be a Jewish establishment leader as a very young person, and was told all the right talking points to fight against anti-Israel stuff. And one day she just decided she was going to try and find out a little bit about the other side. And she went on to eventually help to start If Not Now, and has been an activist for Palestinian freedom. But it actually tracks her development, and I think it's fascinating to watch.
yeah, it's a very personal story. Come on up here. Come on.
I want to just add my own thanks, Rabbi David, for your being here and all that you've given us to think about, and both as a spiritual person and a person just doing the work of compassion, maybe we could call it that, and more. I'm here tonight, even though I'm wearing the clergy collar. I'm a Methodist clergy person, but I'm here tonight as part of the Alameda Families and Friends for Ceasefire Coalition here today. And I want to just give thanks to Twin Towers, actually. They had the good idea. You had the good idea. And we just hopped on and said, hey, we'd love to come alongside. But I'm looking around, Rabbi David, I just know that there's so many congregations represented here today, as well as just the wider community. And I'm grateful that we're able to have this conversation. And it's our desire as AFF4C to continue to have the conversation and do the community building and do the sometimes hard and difficult work to come and be moral and strategic and practical, and all of that together. I want to let you know, and I want to point you towards January 27th. There's two things that are happening that day, hosted by our sister congregation, Buena Vista. Yes, I know. Thank you. Thank you, Austin, who's a member there. And I want to just say, it's not in particular because, oh, the Methodists are so amazing, but they are. I just have to, but it is because we have connections and we work as a connectional system, and there's beauty in that. But we are inviting the beautiful children's author, Hannah Mushabek, to come, and she will be zooming in from the East Coast to tell us more about her book called Homeland. And so that's really inviting. If you have families with kids and you're wondering, like, how do I talk to them about Palestine, or how do I just invite them into the conversation? That's a really great place to start. And right after that, we'll actually be having an open house, because it's our desire to build community. Again and again, I just want to say, the thing that we say together when we come together as AFF4C is how sweet and how beautiful and how grace-filled it is that we get to know each other in community in brand new ways together over these cross sections, because of the work around ceasefire, because of the work around Palestinian liberation. And so I want to just invite you, hey, come and meet us, come bring a dish, and let's just break bread and share some food and have some conversation. So again, that's January 27th. And if you're not on our email list yet, come and talk to myself. Actually, anybody, wave your hand if you're here on AFF4C. Oh, you can talk any of these folks, and then we'll get you kind of connected into the whole thing. Two-part. Yes, no, you don't have to come all 4 hours. No, you don't. Okay. People, human time. With food. Eve has taught me that that the Jewish community always gets together around food. So we have done a disservice to our all right. But I want to invite Pastor Kehilla to have the last word tonight, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much. Again, echoing deep gratitude for Rabbi David joining us this evening, but also to the friends, the Alameda Families and Friends for Ceasefire, right? For all of you for joining us, also for the safety team, the security team who made sure we're safe, all the intentional work, the moderators, right? And Garrett and Eve, thank you so very much. I would also like to acknowledge and thank as Pastor Emily had said too, the All Faiths Coalition members who've come out that we together do this together, right? And then also I would like to thank the Twin Towers team. I'd like to thank and acknowledge Deacon Judith here for ensuring having the relationship and making the invitation that Rabbi David said yes to, as well as our tech team in the back, who, while we saw it go dark, yet the Zoomers were still connected. And so we are very grateful. And last, but definitely not least, for the Great Spirit who invites us to seek peace and share love with one another in every space that we can. So with that, friends, go in peace. Thank you for being here.